On February 24, 1933, gangsters gunned down Dennis Ziegler here in Chicago. Ziegler died in his son's arms. He leaves behind 11 children and his wife, Edna.
I'm Lissa Morgans, and you're listening to Call Edna. Call Edna bonus episode. Welcome to the Scapegoat. Hello and welcome back to Call Edna for our first bonus episode, The Scapegoat, all about Roger Touhy and the memoir that he writes towards the end of his incarceration period in the 1950s. And if you need a quick reminder of who Roger Touhy is, do not worry. We've talked about him in prior episodes, but he's the man who goes away for a fake kidnapping in 1934 of John Factor, nicknamed Jake the Barber, because he was an enemy of Al Capone and his syndicate. In Touhy's book, The Stolen Years, is fascinating because it provides a first-hand account of what he went through in Prohibition-era Chicago as an enemy of Al Capone. And because Bruce was also an enemy of Al Capone, Touhy's book provides a great example of what this was like at this time. And I will say, except for the court stuff at the end, I did not fact-check Touhy's individual life stories, but when we get into his court history at the end, I will be citing to the trial and appellate court records therein. And this book is in the public domain, so through a quick search online, you too will be able to pull it up and read it for free. And before we start breaking down the book, I want to give a quick overview of what the defining moments in Touhy's life that he writes about are. The first is that he's unfairly convicted of a crime he didn't commit. This one's pretty obvious. The second is that while he was incarcerated in 1942, he was part of a famous prison break out of Statesville, Illinois. He was one of 7 incarcerated persons to break out. And third, Touhy won his freedom through a habeas petition in the 1950s through a federal judge, the Honorable John Barnes. And I'll note, this one's only kind of true, which we'll get into a bit later. And unfortunately, this is not a part of what he writes about, but he'll be murdered just a few weeks after his release on December 17th, 1959, as he's on his way to his sister's house. And allegedly 8 months after his killing, there's a payment made from Jake the Barber for $40,000 to none other than Murray Humphreys. So let's get into it. Interestingly enough, the book does not start with his incarceration. It starts with his escape in 1942, which is interesting because although this book is about his relationship with the justice system and Al Capone, we really get an idea of who Touhy is as a person and what his motivations and interests are through this prison escape. So the year is 1942, and someone else in the Statesville prison is plotting an escape. And they approach Touhy to see if he's interested. And he says he's originally not interested in the escape because he still has some stuff on the outside going in his favor. Specifically, he's convinced a Chicago reporter that he is actually innocent, and he thinks this reporter digging through their files and publishing will help prove his claims. But unfortunately, that reporter dies, I believe of natural causes, and Touhy has little else left in his life. He did have a family, a wife and 2 kids, but he sent them away to Florida to live under a new name and instructed them to never visit him. So he's not connected to his family while he's incarcerated. And he's been filing legal claims and hoping to make way in the justice system, but all of his petitions are being denied without a hearing. He even sends one to the Supreme Court of the United States, and it too is turned down without a hearing. So when all these things have combined in his mind, as he puts it, quote, "I wasn't a man anymore. I was a dead thing," end quote. A sentiment I think shared by many in the dehumanizing process of being incarcerated, which I wanted to add I cannot speak to directly, but I can indirectly as a public defender and also someone who was a law clerk seeing people come in chains for their hearings in federal court. So eventually Touhy decides he wants in on the plan, and he's given the date for the escape, October 6, 1942. When that date comes around, nothing happens, and he realizes that this is a fake date, given to all the people involved in the scheme to see if the word got out. Since they all kept quiet, he's then given the real date of the escape, October 9th, 3 days from then. And the escape is quite elaborate. The main guy who planned it seemed to have a relationship with one of the guards at Statesville Prison, and he leverages that relationship amongst other things. Touhy seems to be involved with the part with the truck and a fence, and a whole lot goes on, but eventually all 7 of them are able to make it out, no one is harmed, and they're able to get in the car of a prison guard and drive off. And of course, once they get out, they realize that they need help on the outside. So Touhy reaches to some of his social contacts to see if one of them can get nice fitting clothes and an apartment for them in Chicago. And Touhy's connection comes through. So all of the escapees move in to a basement apartment in Chicago. And in fact, one of the other men involved in the escape is also notably involved in another fake Jake the Barber kidnapping. Touhy then moves into his own apartment because he decides he doesn't want their company. And this is something that's very interesting about Touhy, is at first he enjoys the solitude about being out. It's something that he didn't get while he was incarcerated. You can hear people sleeping, screaming, using the bathroom, etc. None of your time is actually wholly your own. So by the time he's in Chicago, he decides he wants his own peace and quiet. He then gets it and moves into his own apartment, and then he feels incredibly lonely. He doesn't have his family. He doesn't have any traditional friends in the sense that he's in a fugitive status. So although social connections are willing to help him out, he's not really hanging out with them. And it's almost like the only remaining thing in his life is the city of Chicago. The place where he grew up and the place he always lived near seems to be a main character in his life and story, and sort of the last thing he has. And by making the choice to be a fugitive on the run, no longer running, and living in Chicago, the place where he's infamously known, he knows he's going to get caught. And this to me is so fascinating. I don't actually know what it's like for Touhy to go through what he went through, but I think a lot of us would logically think you should get out of there. You should go as far away as possible. You should go to another country. You should go to Alaska, somewhere where you can't be found. But he doesn't do that. He wants to live life on his own terms. And in that way, I actually see a similarity between him and Bruce. And he is eventually caught. After a series of moving around and hanging out with the other escapees and not, eventually someone rats them out, and after being free for 82 days, he's taken back to prison on December 29th, 1942. And after he is caught, he finds out that although Illinois law does not have a penalty or prosecution for incarcerated persons who break out of prison just for that crime itself, as long as you don't harm anyone. By the way, this changes in 1949. Illinois did have a penalty if you aid and abet another in escaping, and you could be prosecuted and sentenced to the same sentence as them. And another man in the escapee group who had the longest sentence is now pinned on Touhy. The sentence the man had is 199 years, and this would be consecutive to Touhy's current sentence, totaling 298 years that he would be on the line for. And this is a big deal because Touhy thought when he escaped that he would at most lose good time. So essentially the system in Illinois as it worked for parole is once you satisfied a third of your sentence, you would be parole eligible. But now that he's potentially facing 298 years, his situation is completely different. He's in a different reality of life without parole, because with that kind of sentence, he's never going to see any form of freedom. Now Touhy pivots into his life, his personal life growing up and how he becomes an enemy of Al Capone. So first off, Roger Touhy is born in 1898, so he's younger than Bruce, and grew up with a cop for a father. He has 6 siblings. To depart briefly from his story, I did find a news article that described his 5 brothers. One was killed attempting a holdup in 1917. Another was shot to death in a battle with Capone gunmen in 1927. One fell in a roadhouse brawl in 1929, and one has an unknown fate. And his mother also dies when he is 10 years old from a kitchen stove exploding and burning her. And at that time, they move from Chicago to a suburb. He eventually becomes a telegraph employee for Western Union, and he meets his wife that way. But they don't marry right off the bat, as World War I and some other odd jobs will take him to different parts of the country. And he's actually fired from Western Union for reading a union pamphlet at work. And this really pisses him off because he says he was just reading the pamphlet and he was actually not in the union. So when this happens, he becomes a union organizer, working to sign up telegraphers to the union. And this is a narrative theme of snitching that we're going to see multiple times in Touhy's life. It's a big deal for him to define himself as not a snitch. So similar in that first section where he's talking about the prison escape, when he gets the fake date of October 6th and then the real date of October 9th, keeping quiet and not snitching is a big personality trait of his. And this also comes up when he's a union organizer, because as union members are signing secret union cards, some of them are getting fired. And so Touhy knows that someone is tipping them off from the office. So he fakes the names of 10 people to test and find out who's the rat. And I think including this story in his days of union organizing is very reflective of his personality. And it also establishes him as pro-union from the get. Then we have World War I, where he taught telegraphy to officers and enlisted men at Harvard for the Navy. I did not check naval records. I'm taking his word for it. And after World War I, he works odd jobs, working in the Oklahoma oil business, and then eventually coming back to Chicago for the car business. This is where he marries the prior employee at Western Union who he met, and they're married in 1922. And now it's firmly prohibition. His car business is doing well, and he decides to get into bootlegging. And he really has a mind for business. Towards the end of his bootlegging career, he starts to reflect on exactly what was going on at that time in Chicago, and I think it's something we've touched on a lot in this investigation. Quoting, "Repeal was on the way, and the syndicate's big profits from gagging whiskey and watery beer soon would be ended. The Great Depression was settling down for a long stay. People didn't have money for gambling. Business in the Capone brothels fell off, even after the price was cut to $1 in some of the dives, with the girl getting 40 cents and the house taking the rest. Banks closed. The Insol Utilities empire fell apart. Insurance companies went bust." End quote. So Touhy is very aware of the environment going on around him, and as he starts his career in bootlegging, he makes a small name for himself and accumulates some wealth, and then decides to move to a Chicago suburb. But around this time is also when he gets on Capone's radar, and in a negative way. There's a couple of stories that he tells. The first one is that Capone tries to buy some beer from him, and then after buying it, he tries to short him on the money owed. And Touhy does not stand for it and demands the full amount paid. And this starts off his relationship with Capone in a negative light, because it's Capone's show. But in response to everything going on, Touhy says he wants to focus on making money, and that meant perfecting his beer business. And he gets a new business partner in a man named Matt Kolb. So Touhy goes into business with Matt Kolb, and he does not consider Matt Kolb to be a gangster. He's just a guy who's great at brewing and running beer in Chicago, except he's not so great at the brewing part. He brews a lot of beer, but it's not of a very high quality. So Touhy partners with him in order to correct that, and focusing on refining the quality. We're in the early 30s, and I think he's thinking, since repeal is on the way, if I have a good product that can be sold legally, once repeal is over, I'll continue to make money and I won't take such a hit with my bootlegging business. But before we can get there, Kolb begins having some run-ins with Capone, and Capone wants payouts from both Kolb and Touhy. There's one instance where Capone kidnaps Kolb and ransoms him back to Touhy. Touhy obviously pays it and then goes and picks him up. And it's at this point that they decide as a business they're not to pay the Capone syndicate a cent more. And I'm not sure if that's something he regrets or not. Capone orders the murder of Kolb in 1931. So while the relationship between Touhy and Capone was sour, it's really sour now. And Touhy thought Capone envied him because he was making a lot of money in an under-the-radar way, whereas Capone was facing a lot of public scrutiny. And given the date, 1931, we know that he's finally being held accountable for tax evasion. But before he goes away for that, there's another story where Capone approaches Touhy about opening up a prostitution ring in the suburbs where Touhy lives. And who Capone sends to speak with Touhy in person is very interesting. One of the men involved is Machine Gun Jack. Another is Frank Diamond, who is listed as the brother-in-law of Capone. And the third is Murray Humphreys. And apparently there's also potentially a meeting organized between him and Frank Nitti, where Touhy is going to have a car sent to him in the suburbs to go meet with Nitti elsewhere. But then Touhy is tipped off and someone calls him and says, hey, they're planning to take you for a ride. You're going to be murdered if you go. So Touhy decides not to go. And that brings us into 1932. As you know, Nitti will eventually take over for Capone, so the disdain for Touhy continues. And there's more times the Capone syndicate approaches Touhy and he says no. And as you know, when the Capone syndicate is approaching you, it's not really for your consent. It's them saying they're going to do it anyway. Another one that's interesting and related to Bruce is that in 1932, Marcus Studdy Looney approaches Touhy with a multi-million-dollar union racket scheme. And Touhy declines this scheme and holds himself out as an ally to unions. In response, I don't know if directly to this or otherwise, there's another incident with Touhy's family, and he's going to blame Murray Humphreys for this one. But apparently, two men try to kidnap his two sons, Tommy and Roger, as they come home from school. Luckily, his wife and their mother is able to pick them up, but then the men are following his wife's car. He gets a phone call and is tipped off to this, and he gets in his own car to then go and find his wife. And luckily, they've pulled over at a farm stand and have lost the Humphreys hitmen, but the threats against him and his family are made very real. And it's clear at this time that the relationship between him and the Capone syndicate is never going to improve. And that's what leads to them finally moving to get rid of him once and for all. So we're in 1933, and it's after Bruce's murder. You may recall that John Factor, Jake the Barber, is evading extradition to the UK for some $7 million scheme that he had done. So in the spring of 1933, when he's supposed to be going to a Supreme Court hearing over his extradition, his son Jerome is kidnapped. And Touhy seems to really like Jerome, so he doesn't speculate that Jerome was in on it, but that his father had arranged for this in order to get out of extradition. And then the Supreme Court reschedules his extradition hearing for May 29th. After that hearing, and I'm not sure if there are others that Touhy doesn't mention, that Barber's going to be extradited to England probably by December of 1933. And this really sets the stage for what's going to go on with this fake kidnapping. So he's, air quotes, kidnapped on the night of June 30th in the early morning of July 1st of 1933. And Touhy states that he was home that evening with his wife, his wife's friend, a bodyguard, and his kids. And Barber is gone for 12 days. And initially, no one besides Dan Gilbert suspects that Touhy is involved. So much so that the newspapers are reporting that this is likely a fake kidnapping in order for Barber to get out of extradition, which, no spoilers here, ends up being true. But because it's reported that Barber was working with the Capone syndicate, and specifically Murray Humphreys, the police immediately begin pivoting this case from a regular investigation into something more sinister. And there seems to be a policeman who's involved in the early stages of this investigation before it went into cover-up mode, who notes a lot of questions and then will eventually testify on Touhy's behalf when he's charged. Quoting from Touhy's book, "Policeman Gerard had some questions in mind. No one else seemed interested, but he wondered at such things as, 1. If Factor had slept, eaten, and lived in the same clothing for 12 days in a basement, how come his suit, shirt, and tie were unsoiled, unstained by perspiration, and virtually unwrinkled? 2nd, if his blindfold had been removed so recently, why hadn't he been blinded by the bright lights in the police station? 3rd, if he had been blindfolded all the time, how had he managed to manicure his nails? Or had, perhaps, the kidnap gang included a manicurist? 4th, Factor claimed that his shoes hadn't been off for 12 days. If so, his feet would have been so swollen and sore that he would hardly be able to step on them. But he wasn't even limping. 5th, if he hadn't bathed for nearly 2 weeks, why didn't he have a gamey adder about him? 6th, who had polished Jake's shoes?" End quote. So it's pretty clear from the get that Jake the Barber is not kidnapped, and Touhy's not initially arrested for this kidnapping. Instead, the Capone syndicate has set up another fake kidnapping for him to fall for. So in the fall of 1933, he's taken to trial in Minnesota, where he's tried for the kidnapping and ransom of someone named Ham, along with his co-defendants. And because there is no eyewitness who eventually places them to the crime, he's eventually acquitted. And I'll note that later on, someone else does confess to this kidnapping. So this one's not fake, it's just that Touhy didn't do it. And Touhy notes who attends the trial, and that's police officer Dan Gilbert and Jake the Barber, which is obviously very suspicious. But now Jake the Barber is facing extradition, and Touhy is still out. So Touhy thinks he and Gilbert and others come up with a plan on behalf of the Capone syndicate, and that's to have Touhy take the fall and allow for Barber to stay in the country. And that brings in State Attorney Thomas Courtney, who then goes to Washington, D.C. to ask the president to keep Jake the Barber here as a star witness in a prosecution kidnapping case. That president, by the way, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he agrees. So now Touhy is being charged with the kidnapping of Jake the Barber. Jake the Barber, as a witness, has to stay in the United States, and Touhy goes to trial in January of 1934. I won't go too in-depth into this trial, but I will say the biggest thing to note is that he clearly has issues with his attorney, and the state's prosecution is messy. Their story is all over the place, and Touhy is upset that he's not able to testify on his own behalf. Quoting from the book, "Stewart, although he knew I was innocent, wouldn't listen to me. His record in defending criminal cases shows that he seldom put a defendant in the witness chair. I threatened to stand up in court and demand of the judge that I be heard. If I did that," Stewart said, "he would walk out of the court. The squabbling between us was endless." End quote. Reading this section, I definitely empathize with both parties, but I will say, as someone who also represented people, it is criminal defense work 101 to not have your client testify. And that's because, to be fully honest, the game is rigged. The game being the trial, and the law being its own language that the witness likely does not know how to speak. And it also opens you up to so many open questions to the prosecution and potentially types of evidence like character evidence that would not be able to come in otherwise could now come in through your own testimony. It really just has the ability to make things incredibly messy, although I do understand an individual's desire to clear their own name. If our criminal justice system was structured in a way that they were focusing on just who committed the crime in general, maybe it would work for you to testify on your own behalf. But the way criminal prosecution works is that they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you committed the crime, you being the accused and you being the person wanting to testify. It is their affirmative duty to get the jury or a judge to make a finding beyond a reasonable doubt. But it doesn't really matter for this first trial because it results in a hung jury. And then the judge wants to retry the case within 2 weeks. Touhy wants to get a new lawyer for the second trial, but because of the timeline, he's not permitted. So there's a second trial. And the trial strategy for this second trial and a lot of the witness testimony is changed. The state has added additional eyewitnesses and cooperating witnesses to their prosecution. And there are witnesses who are now unavailable because they've been threatened or coerced not to testify on Touhy's behalf. And Touhy ends up getting convicted. And he's sentenced to 99 years. So now Touhy is incarcerated, and he becomes obsessed with proving his actual innocence. And the record is full of so many petitions and claims that I couldn't possibly go through them with you today, but he has 2 general claims that he's going to continue to reassert, one of them being actual innocence and the other one being ineffective assistance of counsel. And I'll note that I am someone who also used to review federal habeas petitions. So I am intimately familiar with the difficult ways in which these petitions and the people who bring them interact with our federal court system, as I used to review them at both the trial level and the appellate level. And as a side note, although they're incredibly important for our system, they are also, in my opinion, extremely boring to review because so much of the emphasis is on procedure as opposed to the substantive rights of what happened at trial. So between the mid-1930s and 1950s, Touhy works with various lawyers to put on a case and present evidence in his federal habeas petition of his actual innocence. And he sums them up into 7 main points in his writing. The first 3 relate to 6 people who swear under oath that Jake the Barber was not kidnapped. The 4th had to do with some of the backup cooperating witnesses that the state presented in the second trial, that one of those witnesses was in fact hundreds of miles away and could not have actually seen Touhy commit the act. The 5th point was that there was actually a police lineup done after Jake the Barber was kidnapped where Touhy was in the lineup and Jake the Barber did not point him out. The 6th point was that another eyewitness was actually an employee and operator of the Capone Mob gambling casino. And the 7th, that he was denied effective assistance of counsel because he wanted a different attorney for the second trial and did not trust his attorney. And they had a full breakdown of the relationship prior to the trial, and so during trial, they did not collaborate with one another to put on his defense. So essentially, he's been collecting evidence on the perjured testimony that has been admitted at his trial. And eventually, in the mid-1950s, a federal judge, Judge Barnes, has a bunch of hearings and goes through the entirety of the state court file and finds exactly what Touhy has been saying for almost 20 years. This kidnapping is a hoax. I am not going to quote directly from the trial court's opinion because it's over 611 pages. So instead, I'm going to quote from the appellate record. Quoting, Judge Barnes concluded that the alleged kidnapping of Factor was a hoax, planned by Factor himself to prevent his extradition to Great Britain, that Touhy's conviction of the Factor kidnapping was obtained by the use of perjured testimony known by the state prosecuting officials to have been perjured. Also, that Touhy was denied effective assistance of counsel. The court also held that the Illinois statute pertaining to aiding a prisoner to escape from penitentiary was unconstitutional, and the proceedings against Touhy brought under said statute were null and void. The trial court was of the opinion that the statute was unconstitutional as being in violation of the Equal Protection of Laws Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Judge Barnes ordered that the realtor be discharged from custody. End quote. So Touhy thinks this is it. I have finally proved my innocence, and more than that I was not given sufficient counsel, which is a much higher bar than you would expect. There's this famous court case, I can't exactly remember its name or where it's from, that you learn about in law school, where an attorney was literally doing cocaine and sleeping during trial, but that they were not ineffective because during the times where they were either in the bathroom or sleeping or whatever they were doing, they didn't actually miss any pivotal part of the trial in order to afford the person relief. But Touhy is not going to see full vindication because the state appeals and the appellate court finds differently. Quoting back from the record, However, before considering whether the trial court was correct in holding the escape statute unconstitutional, we are faced with the serious and fundamental question of whether Touhy exhausted his state remedies, end quote. The exhaustion of state remedies is every habeas petitioner's worst nightmare. I understand that the rule makes sense in theory, that if you're convicted in a state, you need to fully exhaust every ability of the state to fix your conviction and issue before you bring that concern to the federal level, a completely different system, in order to have them review the record and look it over. And there are a lot of reasons for this rule. However, exhausting your state court remedies is not like a simple checklist you're given when you're incarcerated. The information is purposely lacking or misleading. A similar exhaustion of administrative remedies is also used in the prison context when it comes to federal prisoners writing a formal grievance to the system. Before they can take that formal grievance to the federal court system through petition or by making a claim, they have to exhaust the administrative remedies of the grievance system at the facility they're at. But the funny thing, and that it's not so funny, they're not given any tools as to how to actually do that. So when you file your first grievance, I can't remember if it's 2 times or 3 times, but often you're supposed to appeal that grievance 2 or 3 times to consider it fully exhausted. But when you receive your negative reply on the first grievance, no one tells you to appeal it, and so you don't do it. And then eventually, if you decide you want to bring a court case because that sounds good to you, you get to the court and they tell you essentially, well, why didn't you appeal that 2 or 3 times within your own system? It's completely convoluted. And with regard to a habeas petition, you're not afforded a free lawyer under our system in order to file one. Your right to counsel as afforded by the Sixth Amendment is for criminal prosecution. It's not so that they can help you bring a habeas petition. And it's a very specialized area of law with not enough people practicing in it. All of this to say is that the system is set up so that you don't properly exhaust your state court remedies. And this is what happens to Touhy. Quoting from the appellate record, "We think Touhy did not exhaust his state court remedies in 2 respects. First, by not prosecuting a writ of error to review his conviction obtained in 1943, and second, by failing to pursue the remedy afforded him under the Illinois Post-Conviction Hearing Act." End quote. And this has everything to do not with his original conviction, of which he's actually innocent, but his second conviction, when he was convicted for aiding a prisoner to escape. That nasty 199-year conviction that's added to his record. That's the hiccup. Quoting again, "It stands as the rarity in this case that Touhy never sought relief under the Illinois Post-Conviction Hearing Act with respect to his conviction for aiding a prisoner to escape. The effective date of that act was August 4th, 1949. Touhy had 3 years thereafter within which to commence a proceeding under that act, and a further period if he could show the delay was not due to culpable negligence. ... He did commence a proceeding under the act in the criminal court of Cook County with reference to his conviction for kidnapping, but for some reason unexplained, he did not challenge in the circuit court of Will County the validity of his conviction under the act pertaining to aiding of a prisoner to escape." End quote. And that's how it often is in our justice system. So even though he's actually innocent of the first crime, once you are in the system and you accumulate any other offenses, it's very hard for all your time to go away. And so the federal court is without jurisdiction. He has not exhausted his state court remedies, so he is no longer free, and he's back to facing a period of incarceration of 298 years. Lucky for Touhy, he finds another way out, and that's through the governor commuting and restructuring his sentence. He agrees to cut the kidnapping charge from 99 years to 72 years, so that he would be eligible for parole at a third of that time, 24 years, which he had already served. Then he reduced the 199-year term to 3 years, and that made Touhy eligible for release in 1959. Quoting from Touhy, By that time, I would have spent more than a quarter of a century in prison for a crime that never happened, end quote. And Touhy considers this a huge success. At the end of his book, he expresses that he does not have any bitterness towards anyone, but, quoting, "Instead, I have the deepest sense of gratitude towards the many people who have befriended me," end quote. He's just excited at this point to get out. But I want to say, I was a lot more skeptical of this deal than Touhy is. I'm not sure exactly how parole worked in Illinois in the 1950s, but understanding the system of parole as I know it, essentially, if you make any mistake in not abiding by the court's terms, often as interpreted by your parole officer, then you can go back to prison and serve the remaining time that's over your head. So by changing his sentence to 72 years and having served 24, I believe going forward, if he had made a mistake in parole, there would still be a huge chunk of time that could be imposed. Also, he's still a felon. He's actually innocent of the underlying crime, but he's still convicted of a felony and the harassments of life that are associated with that. I was not a public defender for a long time, as I was not mentally able to handle the trauma of being a public defender in an overrun system during COVID. However, I believe most public defenders and criminal defense attorneys in general will agree that pleading someone out to their first felony is brutal and emotional, because when you have the title of felon associated with you, the way you interact in this country, socially, politically, are abridged. And that's a hard thing to digest, no matter what the person has done. And I wanted to leave you with some of Touhy's thoughts on some of the people that we've mentioned during this investigation. And those are police officers Daniel Gilbert and William Blau, if you remember him from the list, and also State's Attorney Thomas Courtney. Starting with Blau, I just want to say we have more confirmation that he was an honest police officer and likely not involved in anything regarding Bruce's murder. At some point during his investigation by the police, Touhy interacts with Blau, quoting, "From the FBI offices, we were taken to Chicago Police Headquarters. In charge of the Detective Bureau, they were two tough but almost unbelievably honest police officers. They were Chief of Detectives William Shoemaker and his second in command, Lieutenant William V. Blau. Shoemaker, called Shoes, spent his nights off kicking in the doors of whorehouses and booting pimps around. He and Blau had so much integrity that a good many policemen didn't want to work with them." End quote. So Blau is exactly as we thought, an honest officer. And he didn't have quite as nice words to say about Daniel Gilbert. He cast Gilbert as the main ringleader for the Capone syndicate as opposed to Thomas Courtney. Quoting, "The strong man in the office was, of course, Gilbert. He had years of experience as a policeman. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew the laws of evidence. Courtney, lacking in criminal law experience and police investigative procedure, had to heavily rely on Gilbert's advice. And now it is time for a look at Gilbert's record. During 12 years as chief investigator under Courtney, Gilbert never came up with the evidence to send one Capone mobster, not one, to jail or prison for so much as one day, as Judge Barnes found. Sure, he put me in the penitentiary and tried his best to make it the electric chair, but I was an enemy of the syndicate." End quote. So Touhy does not mince words against Gilbert, although I have to say, as someone who's known both state and federal prosecutors, if they're bringing a case under their own ethical obligations, I'm going to hold them just as accountable for using perjured testimony as the police officer who obtained it. And as we know, Touhy is released from his incarceration after battling for his freedom for over 25 years. And then he's murdered on December 17th, 1959, allegedly by Murray Humphreys. And that made me think about how Touhy left off his book. The last quote that I'll read you from Touhy directly, quoting, "My hope is to live out the few years remaining to me in peace and quiet and freedom with those I love and respect." End quote.